January 12, 1957. At 110 miles per hour, a heavy racing chassis leaves the asphalt. The machine tumbles end over end, tearing metal from frame before throwing the driver into the hard pile. The victim bleeding out on this remote stretch of earth is one of Britain's most hardened champions. He spent years surviving the deadliest racing circuits across Europe. Yet, his skull wasn't shattered by a sudden mechanical failure or a rival's dirty tactic. He died simply because another racer followed a specific, fatal command that he himself had given. January 12, 1957. The Southern Hemisphere summer sun beats down relentlessly on the flat exposed expanse of the Ardmore circuit in New Zealand. Unlike the sweeping, undulating country roads of traditional European tracks, Ardmore is a repurposed wartime airfield. It is a harsh, geometric layout characterized by wide concrete runways, abrasive tarmac, and sudden, unforgiving transitions. The heat rising from the dark surface distorts the air, creating shimmering mirages that dance across the long straights. The atmosphere is thick with the distinct heavy scent of burning aviation fuel, hot oil, and the sharp tang of melting rubber. Emerging from a sweeping high-speed left-hand curve, a deep red Ferrari Monza roars onto the main pit straight. The Monza is a pure, uncompromising machine of mid-50s Italian engineering. It is not delicate. It is a heavy, muscular sports racing car built around a massive, thundering engine designed to conquer the grueling endurance races of the continent. The raw, guttural howl of the exhaust notes reverberates off the wooden grandstands as the driver holds the throttle pedal firm against the metal floorboard. The machine accelerates rapidly down the wide runway, the speedometer needle climbing steadily and pushing past 110 miles per hour. At this speed, roughly 177 kilometers per hour, the physical reality inside the open cockpit is a brutal assault on the human senses. The wind does not merely blow, it tears at the driver's canvas goggles and pulls at his clothing. The heavy steering wheel vibrates with a frantic, nervous energy, transmitting every single pebble, seam, and imperfection of the concrete directly into the driver's forearms. Keeping the heavy Italian chassis traveling in a straight line requires immense physical exertion, a constant, calculated wrestle between human muscle and raw mechanical torque. Lining the edges of the pit straight, separating the high-speed racing line from the vulnerable mechanics and spectators, are various temporary structures. Among them stands a tall, sturdy wooden pylon, erected specifically to hold a wide promotional banner high above the track surface. To protect the drivers from the solid wooden pillar, the race organizers placed dense, tightly bound bales of agricultural straw around its concrete base. In the rudimentary safety logic of the era, straw bales were considered a sufficient cushion to absorb the impact of a sliding vehicle. The grim, undeniable truth of physics, however, paints a vastly different picture. When tightly packed, heavy agricultural straw sits out in the sun and is compressed by its own weight, it loses all forgiving qualities. When struck by a heavy metal object traveling at highway speeds, a straw bale does not yield like a soft pillow. It acts like a dense, solid ramp of unyielding brick. As the deep red Ferrari hurtles down the pit straight, the distance between the speeding machine and the banner pylon closes in a matter of fractions of a second. The exact trajectory of the car drifts slightly wide. The impact is not a glancing blow. It is direct, heavy, and catastrophic. The right front corner of the Ferrari Monza strikes the dense stack of straw bales at 110 miles per hour. To understand the horrific sequence of events that follows, time must be slowed down to a crawl, dissecting the raw physics of a high-speed collision. when the front right tire and the heavy steel suspension components bury themselves into the immovable straw. The forward momentum of that specific corner of the car halts instantly. 0 miles per hour in a microsecond. However, the rest of the machine, the heavy engine block, the sloshing tanks of racing fuel, the dense tubular chassis, and the driver himself, still carries the immense, terrifying kinetic energy of traveling at maximum velocity. The energy cannot simply vanish. Denied a forward path, the immense force finds the only available route of escape. It travels upward. The right front wheel acts as a sudden locked pivot point. The heavy tail section of the Ferrari is forced fiercely into the air. The rear tires break their mechanical grip on the tarmac, lifting toward the clear blue sky. The Italian chassis, weighing thousands of pounds, entirely leaves the earth. The car begins a terrifying, high-speed somersault. It does not slide, and it does not spin horizontally. It tumbles end over end, driven forward by its own dissipating momentum. The deep red nose of the machine arcs through the air, followed by the heavy tail, rotating like a colossal, discarded toy thrown by an invisible hand. As the heavy metal chassis rotates through the air, the physical laws of centripetal acceleration take firm command of the open cockpit. In 1957, the concept of a multi-point safety harness strapping a driver securely into a reinforced carbon fiber survival cell did not exist. Drivers sat on simple, leather-wrapped bucket seats. Their bodies held in place by nothing more than the physical grip of their own hands on the steering wheel and the shallow sides of the metal tub. The prevailing, flawed philosophy of the era dictated that it was preferable to be thrown clear of a crashing vehicle rather than remain trapped inside a potentially burning wreck. The spinning Ferrari transforms into a massive centrifuge. The sheer, overwhelming force of the rotation pulls the driver upward, away from the leather seat. His grip on the large wooden steering wheel is instantly broken by forces far exceeding human strength. He is peeled out of the cockpit. He is ejected into the open air. The driver travels through the sky on his own terrifying trajectory, entirely separate from the tumbling wreckage of his machine. For a brief, suspended moment, the human body traces a high arc above the Ardmore circuit. The heavy canvas racing overalls flap in the wind as gravity reclaims its hold. He falls back toward the earth. The landing is brutal, direct, and profoundly unforgiving. The driver strikes the hard, abrasive tarmac of the pit straight. The impact delivers a massive, immediate, blunt force shock to his unprotected body. The thin leather aviator helmet offers zero defense against the unforgiving density of the concrete. He sustains catastrophic cranial trauma the instant his skull connects with the ground. He slides across the rough surface, his limbs lifeless, before coming to a motionless halt in the very center of the racing line. A few yards away, the heavy Ferrari Monza completes its final rotation. It slams back down onto the track with a deep, resonant crash. The sound of thick tubular steel bending and tearing echoing across the airfield. A cloud of concrete dust, pulverized straw, and gray smoke erupts into the air, slowly drifting across the scene of the devastation. In the immediate aftermath of the impact, a heavy, suffocating silence descends upon the Ardmore grandstands. Just seconds prior, the air was filled with the deafening, celebratory roar of thousands of spectators and the screaming pitch of racing engines. Now, the collective breath of the crowd is caught in their throats. The cheering abruptly ceases, replaced by a chilling stillness. The only sounds remaining are the ticking of the cooling metal from the shattered Ferrari and the soft hiss of leaking fluids pooling on the hot runway. The spectators, the pit crews, and the track marshals simply stare at the scene playing out before them. They look past the smoking, twisted wreckage of the red sports car. Their eyes are fixed firmly on the solitary, unmoving figure lying motionless on the gray tarmac under the bright New Zealand sun. The battered body, lying motionless in the middle of the Ardmore circuit, belonged to a legend, a man who had forced death to bow down time and again across the infernos of Europe, only to let his life slip away at a distant race over a tiny ripple. The shattered body, lying on the sun-baked tarmac of the Southern Hemisphere, belonged to Ken Wharton. Born in 1916, he was not a novice seeking early glory, nor was he an inexperienced gentleman racer purchasing a seat in a fast machine. Within the insulated, smoke-filled garages of European motorsport, Wharton was an established institution. He was a man who had forged his reputation in the heavy grease, cold steel, and raw danger of the post-war racing era. The 1950s represented a unique chapter in automotive history. Drivers rarely specialized. The machines they drove were mechanical brutes, lacking power steering, aerodynamic downforce, or reliable brakes. Mastering one type of these heavy vehicles was considered a lifelong achievement. Ken Wharton, however, mastered them all. He was one of the most versatile, multifaceted talents the United Kingdom had ever produced. Yet, history often leaves him resting quietly in the shadows of more publicized names. Wharton did not just compete in Formula One. He drove long-distance endurance sports cars. He navigated the grueling, unpredictable terrain of international rallying, wrestling heavy saloons through snow, mud, and dark mountain passes. He understood the language of internal combustion across every possible discipline. He could finish a grueling, multi-day rally across the treacherous roads of the Alps, wash the dirt from his face, and immediately strap himself into an open-wheel Grand Prix car to race against the greatest factory teams in the world. He possessed a rare, intrinsic understanding of vehicle dynamics. He knew how to read the grip levels of cold tires on damp asphalt, how to manage the fading heat of drum brakes, and how to balance the heavy front-engine chassis using only the throttle pedal. But his most defining, unprecedented achievement, the record that cemented his status as a master of vehicle control, occurred far away from the wide, sweeping circuits of Formula One. It happened on the narrow, treacherous inclines of the British Hill Climb Championship. Hill climbing is a singular, unforgiving discipline. There are no warm-up laps to bring the engine to optimal temperature. There are no wide runoff areas to catch a sliding car. The driver lines up at the bottom of a steep, narrow paved road that winds its way up a mountain or a rural hillside. The edges of the track are defined by solid stone walls, thick tree trunks, and sheer drops. When the starting flag falls, the driver must launch a cold machine off the line and instantly push it to its mechanical limit. It requires a level of cold, instant precision that few human beings possess. A single millimeter of oversteer, a braking point missed by a fraction of a second, results in an immediate collision with the landscape. Ken Wharton treated these dangerous, narrow ascents as his personal domain. Between the years 1951 and 1954, he achieved something no other driver had ever done. He won the British Hill Climb Championship 4 consecutive times. 4 years of launching heavy, high-horsepower machines up rural lanes without a single fatal error. 4 years of perfectly memorizing every bump, camber, and surface change of the British hillsides. This unparalleled streak required more than just raw bravery. It required a surgical, mathematical approach to speed. Wharton had to understand exactly how the weight of the fuel load transferred to the rear axle under heavy acceleration, and exactly how the bias ply tires would deform under severe lateral loads. He was a mechanic in the cockpit, calculating the physics of his machine in real time. This immense level of skill birthed a specific aura around him. In a decade where the mortality rate for racing drivers was grim, where men were buried on a monthly basis, Wharton seemed to possess a quiet, unshakable immunity to the Reaper. He was viewed by his peers as a survivor. He had seen the worst the European circuits had to offer. He had driven through the most treacherous conditions in international rallies, and he always returned to the paddock. He was the seasoned veteran, the quiet professional who knew exactly where the edge was and how to walk right beside it without falling over. This aura of immortality was put to the ultimate test in 1955. The location was Silverstone, a high-speed airfield circuit in England. Wharton was behind the wheel of a Vanwall, a heavy, powerful British Grand Prix car. During the race, a sudden loss of control sent the heavy green machine off the track. The impact with the barriers was severe. The tubular steel chassis buckled under the force. But the true danger of 1950s racing was rarely the blunt force of the initial impact. The real horror lived within the thin, vulnerable fuel tanks that surrounded the driver. The impact severed the main fuel lines. High-octane racing fuel, highly volatile and corrosive, spilled over the fractured metal. It found the superheated exhaust pipes. In a fraction of a second, the Vanwall ignited. The cockpit became a trap of searing heat. Thick, dark smoke choked the air. Wharton was strapped inside an open metal tub, surrounded by a roaring chemical fire. The flames licked at his racing suit, burning through the thin fabric and reaching his skin. For the spectators and mechanics watching from the pit lane, it was a familiar, dreaded sight. The fire usually meant the end. Yet, from the center of the burning wreckage, a figure emerged. Wharton managed to unbuckle himself and pull his body out of the flaming Vanwall. He sustained severe, agonizing burns to his arms and body. The medical staff rushed to treat the charred skin, administering what little pain relief was available at the trackside hospital. The physical toll of such an event is massive, but the psychological damage is often permanent. Many drivers who survive a severe fire never return to the cockpit. The smell of hot oil or the sound of a revving engine triggers a paralyzing fear. They walk away from the sport, their nerves shattered by the heat. Ken Wharton did not walk away. He embodied a specific, quiet stoicism characteristic of his generation. He did not grant dramatic interviews about his near-death experience. He did not complain about the severe pain of the skin grafts or the long, arduous process of physical recovery. He simply let his body heal, dusted the ash from his shoulders, and quietly returned to the garages. He put his racing goggles back on and gripped the heavy wooden steering wheel once again. To the racing community, his return from the Silverstone fire solidified his myth. He was no longer just a skilled driver. He was the man the fire could not consume. He was the 4-time hill climb champion who had looked directly into the flames, absorbed the agonizing pain of the burns, and refused to surrender his profession. He seemed tethered to the earth by an invisible, unbreakable thread. The tight hairpins of Monaco, the endless straights of Reims, and the heavy stone walls of the British hillsides had all tried to claim him, and they had all failed. He stood as a towering, seemingly indestructible figure in a sport defined by its fragility. Undefeated by the hazards of Europe, Wharton decided to bring a fleet of supercars halfway across the world to conquer New Zealand. But he did not foresee that this expedition to display his power would be the very place where the most ruthless curse was cast. The logistical undertaking required to compete in the Southern Hemisphere during the 1950s was a grueling test of patience and financial resources. An independent driver could not simply place a car on a cargo plane and arrive in a foreign country a few days later. It required loading heavy, delicate machinery deep into the dark, salt-stained holds of commercial shipping vessels. The journey across the ocean took weeks. When Ken Wharton arrived at the docks in New Zealand to contest the Ardmore event, He did not present himself as a solitary, hopeful entrant looking to borrow aging local equipment. He arrived with the commanding presence and material wealth of a one-man racing empire. He brought a fleet of highly specialized, elite European vehicles designed to conquer every single class of competition available on the schedule. The mechanics meticulously unloaded the crates, revealing a trio of pristine machines that stood in stark contrast to the dusty, makeshift environment of the airfield circuit. First was the Maserati 250F. This was the absolute pinnacle of Grand Prix engineering at the time. An elegant, perfectly balanced open-wheel car featuring a powerful inline-six engine utilized by world champions across Europe. Next came a Cooper Climax 1500 cubic centimeter, a small, nimble, rear-engined chassis designed specifically for precision handling in the smaller capacity races. Finally, the crew rolled out the sports car entry, a heavy, muscular Ferrari Monza. Painted in the deep signature red of the Maranello factory, the Monza was a wide machine packing a massive four-cylinder engine built for endurance and raw, straight-line torque. Lining these three expensive, factory-built machines up in the New Zealand paddock sent a clear, unspoken message to the local competitors. Wharton was an elite, seasoned professional operating on an entirely different tier of motorsport. The Ardmore circuit, consisting mainly of wide concrete runways connected by sharp, makeshift corners, drew a highly mixed grid. The entry list featured a handful of traveling professionals mixed with local enthusiasts. These domestic drivers brought whatever machinery they could afford or build in their own sheds. They drove modified road cars, aging pre-war chassis, and heavy, unpredictable specials. The speed disparity between a thoroughbred Ferrari Monza and a local home-built special was vast. It created an inherently hazardous environment on the track. A professional driver pushing for lap records would inevitably catch up to the slower traffic within a matter of minutes. Navigating a high-horsepower machine through moving roadblocks on a concrete runway required extreme caution, sharp reflexes, and above all, absolute predictability from the other drivers. This specific logistical danger brings the narrative to the evening of January 11th, the night before the engines were scheduled to fire. Inside a quiet, dimly lit wooden building near the edge of the airfield, the race organizers gathered the entire grid for the mandatory pre-race driver's briefing. The air inside the room was thick with the gray haze of tobacco smoke, and the quiet, nervous murmur of men anticipating the dangers of the following day. Drivers stood around reading typed schedule changes and reviewing the hand-drawn maps of the circuit layout. Within the confines of this room, the natural hierarchy of the sport was invisible but deeply felt. The local amateurs stood quietly near the back and listened. The international veterans stood near the front and spoke. Ken Wharton, carrying the distinct authority of a four-time British hill climb champion and a recognized survivor of the European circuits, took the floor. He addressed the race director and the room at large, focusing entirely on the most pressing safety issue of the weekend, the massive speed difference between the imported European cars and the local entries. Wharton was not arrogant in his delivery, but his tone was uncompromising and firm. He knew he would be piloting the powerful Ferrari Monza the next day, a car that would easily swallow the long concrete straights and quickly bear down on the slower traffic. He needed to know exactly what the driver ahead of him would do when the large red nose of the Ferrari suddenly filled their rearview mirrors. In the high-speed environment of motorsport, hesitation, indecision, or unpredictable movements are the primary causes of fatal collisions. He needed a standardized system. Wharton used his status to demand strict adherence to international racing protocols. He looked around the room at the faces of the local drivers and delivered a clear, non-negotiable instruction. He stated that when a slower car sees a faster machine approaching from behind, The slower driver must not panic. They must not brake suddenly, and they must not weave across the center line to defend a position they cannot hold. Instead, they must hold their nerve and move their vehicle deliberately and smoothly to the right side of the track. By pulling over to the right edge of the concrete, the slower cars would leave the standard racing line, the optimal, fastest, and most sweeping path through the corners and down the straights, wide open on the left. It was a logical, standard rule utilized on tracks across the world. It established a clear line of communication between strangers traveling at high velocities. The slower drivers nodded in agreement, understanding the logic. The race organizers noted the instruction, establishing it as the official rule of engagement for the weekend. The meeting eventually concluded. Chairs scraped against the floor, and the men filed out into the cool evening air to get whatever sleep they could manage before dawn. When examining the historical records of motorsport, this specific moment in the briefing room stands as a chilling, profound tragedy of fate. Wharton utilized his veteran status to establish a clear safety parameter. He looked the local drivers in the eye and told them exactly where to place their cars to avoid a catastrophe. He laid down the law of the track to protect himself and his fellow competitors from the dangers of the speed disparity. He had no way of knowing that, standing in that smoky room, he was verbally drafting the exact blueprint of his own demise. He was setting up the precise geometric parameters of a fatal collision. Every logical word he spoke regarding track position and yielding protocols was a mechanism being set into place. The strict order for slower traffic to move to the right side of the track was not a protective shield. It was the crucial missing component of a lethal equation. Wharton established order with the authority of a champion. The next morning, the Ferrari roared to the starting line, and the very perfect rule he proposed triggered an irreversible trap. The New Zealand Grand Prix progresses steadily toward its midpoint. The initial chaos of the starting grid has faded, settling into a rhythmic, high-speed procession under the southern hemisphere sun. The engines have reached their optimal operating temperatures, and the drivers are locked into the grueling physical labor required to navigate the Ardmore circuit. Ken Wharton is piloting the deep red Ferrari Monza down the long, flat expanse of the main pit straight. The massive four-cylinder engine hums with a deep, resonant pitch, propelling the heavy Italian chassis forward at a steady 110 miles per hour. At this velocity, the concrete runway is consumed at a rate of over 160 feet every single second. The margin for cognitive processing is reduced to mere fractions of a heartbeat. The driver must read the track, anticipate the machine's behavior, and make critical decisions in an environment where time is severely compressed. Far ahead on the shimmering gray surface, a slower local entrant appears in the Ferrari's path. The speed differential between the thoroughbred sports car and the local machine is vast. Wharton is catching the slower traffic at an alarming rate. This is not an unexpected hazard. It is the exact, specific scenario that occupied Wharton's mind the previous evening. This is the precise moment the rule was designed to govern. The local driver, acting with commendable situational awareness, checks his mirrors and identifies the low, red profile of the rapidly approaching Monza. He remembers the strict, authoritative instruction delivered by the British champion during the driver's briefing. The protocol is clear. The slower car must yield the racing line and move to the right. Without hesitation, the local driver complies. He steers his vehicle smoothly to the right edge of the track, leaving the optimal, sweeping left-hand line completely unobstructed. He performs his role perfectly, following the safety measure to the letter. It is at this exact juncture that the timeline fractures, presenting a 3-second window of inexplicable human error. In the open cockpit of the Ferrari, Wharton must read the movement of the car ahead and choose his trajectory. He is a man who processes speed, spatial relationships, and vehicle dynamics better than almost anyone in his era. Yet, a fatal miscalculation occurs. The root cause of this error remains locked forever in the past. Perhaps the intense, unfiltered glare bouncing off the light concrete obscured his depth perception. Perhaps the physical exhaustion of wrestling the heavy steering wheel through the tight airfield corners had momentarily dulled his razor-sharp reflexes. Or perhaps it was a simple, momentary cognitive misfire. A split second where instinct betrayed logic. Whatever the internal mechanism, Wharton makes a decision that defies his own established rule. Instead of holding his speed and passing cleanly through the wide-open space on the left, Wharton steers the heavy Ferrari Monza to the right. He aims his machine directly into the path of the yielding vehicle. The realization of the mistake must have been instantaneous and chilling. The space he intended to occupy is already taken. To avoid a catastrophic, high-speed rear-end collision, Wharton is forced into immediate evasive action. He jerks the heavy wooden steering wheel even further to the right. The Ferrari clears the slower car, but this sudden, sharp maneuver pushes the machine entirely off the swept, clean concrete of the established racing line. The car crosses an invisible boundary and enters the treacherous outer margins of the runway. This is where the physical trap lies waiting. The edges of the Ardmore circuit, like many repurposed airfields, are not composed of solid tarmac. They are a loose, unpredictable collection of fine gravel, small stones, and metal shavings that have been swept away from the racing line by the passing cars. In the realm of motorsport physics, driving onto this loose material at 110 miles per hour is the equivalent of driving a heavy vehicle over a sheet of ball bearings. The primitive bias ply tires rely entirely on the friction generated by a clean contact patch with the road. The moment the hot rubber meets the layer of loose gravel, that critical mechanical bite simply vanishes. The transition from static grip to a kinetic slide is absolute. The Ferrari loses traction. The heavy tail section of the car steps out, the rear wheels spinning uselessly against the shifting stones. The machine begins a sickening, high-speed slide across the edge of the circuit. The steering wheel goes light in Wharton's hands, signaling the terrifying loss of connection with the earth. This is the moment where Wharton's vast, unparalleled experience as a four-time hill climb champion and international rally driver takes over. His muscle memory reacts before conscious thought. His hands move with precise, measured input on the wooden rim, rapidly counter-steering to catch the swinging pendulum of the heavy engine block. He balances the throttle, fighting the physics of the slide, utilizing decades of skill to rein in the mass of metal. He battles the slide with the cold precision of a master craftsman. The nose of the car begins to snap back into line. He is actively saving the machine. Measurements taken by track officials after the event revealed an agonizing, heartbreaking detail that compounds the tragedy of the day. Wharton was successfully fighting the car back toward the clean track surface. He was a mere 30 yards, exactly 27 meters, away from re-entering the safe tarmac. 30 yards from regaining grip, stabilizing the chassis, and continuing the race. But momentum is a mathematical certainty that does not respect human effort or past championships. The sliding trajectory, established the moment the tires hit the loose gravel, carries the heavy Ferrari diagonally across the edge of the track. The kinetic energy pushes the car inexorably toward the wooden banner pylon and its dense base of packed straw. The masterful fight for control ends with the sudden, deafening sound of tearing steel and a heavy resonant impact. All efforts to regain control failed against the force of inertia. The impact threw him out, but the most haunting question remains. Did death truly come from the concrete pillar, or from another dark truth hidden inside the cockpit? The dust settling over the concrete runway marked the end of the spectacle and the beginning of a grim medical reality. Track marshals and local police moved slowly across the tarmac, pushing back the silent, stunned spectators who had gathered against the boundary fences. The twisted, leaking chassis of the Ferrari Monza was unceremoniously dragged away from the racing line, clearing the path so the event could eventually resume. But the focus of the afternoon had already shifted entirely away from the circuit. Contrary to the rapid, hushed rumors that immediately rippled through the wooden grandstands, the British champion did not perish the moment his body struck the earth. He was unconscious, his breathing shallow and labored, but the heavy toll of the physical impact had not yet finalized its work. He was carefully lifted onto a canvas stretcher, his racing overalls stained with dust and dark oil. The medical personnel placed him into the back of a waiting ambulance and transported him away from the noise and heat of the airfield. The destination was Middlemore Hospital, a major medical facility located in the southern suburbs of Auckland. The journey from the makeshift track to the sterile confines of the hospital ward represented a stark, sobering transition. Wharton left behind the high-octane realm of roaring engines, international prestige, and the smell of burning rubber, entering a quiet, clinical world defined by white walls, hushed voices, and the sharp chemical scent of medical antiseptics. Inside Middlemore Hospital, the medical staff faced a deeply critical scenario. The blunt force trauma sustained from the high-speed ejection and the subsequent fall to the concrete was profound. In 1957, neurological trauma care lacked the advanced imaging, complex surgical interventions, and specialized life support systems that define modern medicine. The doctors and nurses tended to him with the limited tools and knowledge available to their era. They monitored his vital signs as his strong, athlete's body struggled against the catastrophic internal damage and the severe cranial injuries. The quiet, rhythmic ticking of the hospital wall clock replaced the deafening roar of the combustion engines he had commanded for so long. Despite the dedicated, desperate efforts of the New Zealand medical team, the damage was simply too extensive to reverse. Ken Wharton, the seasoned veteran who had navigated the most treacherous mountain passes of Europe and walked out of burning wreckage at Silverstone, drew his final breath in a quiet hospital bed, thousands of miles away from the British hillsides he had once conquered. The news of his passing filtered slowly back to the paddock at Ardmore. The confirmation of his death cast a heavy, suffocating shadow over the remainder of the 1957 New Zealand Grand Prix. The mechanics packed away their heavy steel tools with a slow, deliberate solemnity. The remaining drivers strapped themselves back into their machines, their faces drawn and pale, burdened by the fresh, inescapable reminder of their own mortality. The vibrant, festive atmosphere of the Southern Hemisphere summer race was extinguished, replaced by a lingering sense of mourning and profound loss. This specific tragedy etched a dark, permanent mark into the local history books. Ken Wharton's crash became the first, and ultimately the only, fatal incident ever recorded in the operational history of the Ardmore circuit. A track that was relatively simple and flat in its layout had managed to claim one of the most experienced, resilient drivers of the decade. Following any fatal incident in professional motorsport, the focus shifts away from the medical staff and lands heavily on the desks of the governing bodies. The shattered remains of the Ferrari were impounded, and an official investigation was promptly launched by the race organizers and local authorities to determine the exact sequence of events that led to the tragedy. In the modern era, such an investigation would involve exhaustive telemetry analysis, accident reconstruction experts, precise laser measurements, and sweeping changes to track infrastructure. But in the late 1950s, the administrative approach to driver safety and incident review was fundamentally different. The culture of the sport at an institutional level was deeply rooted in a stoic, almost fatalistic philosophy. The investigative committee, comprised of racing officials and local authorities, examined the physical evidence left at the scene. They walked the edge of the concrete runway, looking at the loose gravel where the Ferrari first lost traction. They inspected the placement of the promotional banner and the specific arrangement of the protective straw bales that surrounded its solid wooden base. They reviewed the typed statements of the track marshals who stood at the corner and the drivers who witnessed the long sliding trajectory of the red sports car. The resulting official conclusion was a testament to the chilling, bureaucratic coldness of early motorsport administration. The official report stated, with firm legal language, that the event organizers had taken all reasonable and necessary precautions to ensure the safety of the competing drivers. The organizers pointed directly to the straw bales placed around the solid pylon. In the context of the rulebooks of 1957, these bales were deemed an acceptable and standard safety measure. The investigation bypassed the physical reality that tightly packed agricultural straw acts as a solid, immovable ramp when struck by a heavy object traveling at high speeds. Because the bales were present, the organizers argued that their duty of care had been fulfilled. The administration essentially absolved the circuit layout and the organizational structure of any direct negligence. The death of Ken Wharton was officially classified under the broad, unforgiving umbrella of inherent risk. The governing bodies maintained a firm, unyielding stance. Automobile racing at high speeds is fundamentally and unavoidably dangerous. By signing the entry forms, paying the fees, and putting on their leather helmets, the drivers actively acknowledged and accepted that death was a highly probable outcome of their chosen profession. If a driver made a minor error in judgment, or if a car lost traction on a loose patch of gravel and left the designated racing line, the resulting consequences, no matter how severe, were considered the sole responsibility of the man behind the wheel. There was no widespread call from the authorities to redesign the circuit boundaries. There was no immediate sweeping demand to remove solid obstacles like wooden pylons from the high-speed runoff areas. And there was certainly no mandate to rethink the primitive use of straw as a safety barrier. The officials viewed the tragedy as a closed loop. The paperwork was typed, signed, and stamped. The official file was closed, placed into a cabinet, and the international racing world prepared to pack its shipping crates and move on to the next venue. This official verdict highlights a deeply unsettling reality regarding the value of human life in that specific era. The life of a multi-time champion, a man possessed of rare, multifaceted talent and immense mechanical knowledge, was reduced to a calculated occupational hazard. His sudden departure from the world was rationalized away as the standard, acceptable cost of doing business in the global pursuit of speed. The men in suits sitting behind wooden desks viewed the loss of life as a tragic but entirely unavoidable byproduct of the spectacle they organized and profited from. They looked at the crash site, saw no broken administrative rules, and simply determined that it was Wharton's unfortunate turn to pay the ultimate toll. The quiet dismissal of the tragedy left a bitter, silent resonance within the European garages. Wharton's family and his peers in the British racing community received the news of the official inquest with the hardened resilience that defined their generation. They did not launch public protests, nor did they file massive lawsuits against the New Zealand track owners. They understood the cold, unwritten rules of the game they played. When a driver of Wharton's caliber died, the community mourned the man, celebrated his records on the European hillsides, and accepted the official narrative that fate had simply caught up with him on a dusty airfield. The governing institutions relied entirely on this stoic acceptance to maintain the status quo. If every fatal crash resulted in a fundamental questioning of the sport's safety and infrastructure, the races would become too complex and expensive to operate. Therefore, the institution required the concept of inherent risk to function smoothly. It was a convenient psychological shield that protected the organizers from the moral weight of the bodies they left behind on the tarmac. The file on Ken Wharton at the Ardmore circuit gathered dust in the archives. The official narrative was sealed in ink. A tragic slide, an unfortunate impact, an accepted risk. The organizers blamed fate, but science does not. Decades later, when dissecting the files of Ken Wharton's death, people made a stunning discovery. The killer was not the crash itself, but the absence of a simple, lifeless piece of fabric. The officials closed the file on the 1957 New Zealand Grand Prix by blaming the inherent, unavoidable risks of motorsport. However, modern forensic science and decades of subsequent crash data offer a vastly different, deeply unsettling perspective on the true cause of the tragedy at Ardmore. When analytical minds look past the administrative excuses and examine the raw biomechanics of the collision, the focus shifts away from the straw bales and the loose gravel on the edge of the runway. The investigation narrows down to the precise interior of the Ferrari Monza cockpit and the glaring, fatal absence of a fundamental piece of safety equipment. The root cause of the fatal cranial trauma was not the violent deceleration of the car against the obstacle. It was the direct, unprotected impact of the human body against the concrete runway. To comprehend why a highly experienced professional racing driver was allowed to be ejected from a tumbling vehicle, one must understand the flawed psychological and engineering landscape of 1950s motorsport. The mechanical capability to install safety restraints certainly existed. The aviation industry had successfully utilized complex harness systems for decades to secure pilots during violent maneuvers. Yet, European race car constructors deliberately omitted them from their designs, and the drivers themselves actively refused to wear them. The prevailing philosophy of the era was rooted in a profound, visceral fear of fire. The highly volatile fuel tanks, often located directly alongside or behind the driver, were prone to rupturing upon heavy impact. Drivers firmly believed that being strapped securely into the tight confines of a cockpit was tantamount to being tied to a ticking incendiary bomb. They genuinely felt that their best chance of survival in a major accident was to be thrown clear of the wreckage before the spilled fuel could ignite. For a man like Ken Wharton, this specific fear was not merely a theoretical concept discussed in the paddock. It was a lived, agonizing reality. He had already experienced the suffocating horror of being trapped inside a burning Van Wald chassis at the Silverstone circuit 2 years prior. He had felt the intense heat of the flames, endured the severe pain of the resulting burns, and spent months recovering from the ordeal. It is entirely logical that a veteran survivor of a racing fire would possess a deep psychological aversion to being locked into a potential furnace. The culture of the sport validated this belief, treating the lack of a restraint system not as an engineering oversight, but as a necessary, calculated strategy for preserving human life. But physics is a cold, unforgiving discipline that completely ignores human psychology, past traumas, and era-specific superstitions. The concept of being safely thrown clear from a crashing vehicle is a deadly, romanticized myth. When a heavy machine traveling at over 100 miles per hour suddenly strikes a stationary object and begins to tumble through the air, the unrestrained human body resting inside does not gently float away to a safe distance. According to the fundamental, unbreakable laws of motion, an object in motion remains in motion. When the heavy Ferrari rapidly decelerated and forcefully changed its trajectory into a vertical somersault, Wharton's body continued moving forward at the original, terrifying velocity. The open cockpit instantly transformed into a brutal mechanical centrifuge. The immense rotational forces generated by the flipping mass of metal easily and immediately overpowered his physical grip on the wooden steering wheel. He was violently extracted from the leather seat and launched into the open air as a human projectile. Modern forensic analysis and decades of comprehensive automotive accident data provide a staggering, grim statistical reality regarding this exact physical scenario. Being ejected from a rolling vehicle does not save a life. Data confirms that being thrown from a crashing vehicle increases the risk of a fatal outcome by an astonishing 500%. The human skeletal structure, particularly the fragile casing of the skull, is simply not engineered to absorb the massive kinetic energy generated by a freefall onto solid, abrasive tarmac at highway speeds. When a driver is ejected, they instantly lose all the protective benefits of the vehicle's surrounding metal structure. A racing car, despite being heavily battered and torn apart during a rollover, is fundamentally designed to bend, crush, and absorb kinetic energy through mechanical deformation. The human head cannot bend. When Wharton struck the New Zealand runway, his skull absorbed the entire, undiluted force of the impact, resulting in immediate, catastrophic neurological trauma. The tumbling Ferrari Monza, while severely damaged, did not experience a complete structural collapse of the driver's seating area. The heavy engine block in the front and the substantial mass of the rear axle absorbed the brunt of the destructive forces, leaving the internal space relatively intact. This physical reality leads directly to the most painful, heartbreaking statistic in the entire narrative of early automotive safety. Extensive medical and forensic studies confirm that nearly 80% of all victims who suffer fatal injuries due to being thrown from a vehicle could have survived the ordeal. They could have lived if they had utilized one simple, rudimentary device, a basic lap belt. A lap belt consisting of nothing more than a strip of woven canvas webbing anchored securely to the strong steel points of the chassis, serves a singular, vital mechanical function. It anchors the human pelvis, the heaviest and most structurally stable part of the body, directly to the mass of the vehicle. By securing the driver firmly to the seat, the belt forces the machine to do the destructive work of absorbing the crash energy. If a simple lap belt had been installed in the red Ferrari on that January afternoon, the entire sequence of events would have been radically different. When the car struck the straw bales and began its violent somersault, the heavy webbing would have locked tight across Wharton's waist. He would have been subjected to immense, punishing physical forces. He would have been violently shaken inside the cockpit as the world spun around him in a chaotic blur of blue sky and gray concrete. He likely would have suffered broken collarbones from the lateral movements against the sides of the car. He might have sustained fractured ribs from the extreme pressure of the canvas belt itself digging into his torso. He almost certainly would have suffered a severe concussion from the extreme rotational forces rattling his brain within his skull, but he would have remained securely inside the metal tub. The heavy steel frame of the Ferrari would have taken the devastating, repetitive blows against the runway, physically shielding his fragile body from the direct, unyielding impact with the earth. The singular, skull-crushing blow that ended his life on the Ardmore circuit would never have occurred. The 80% survival probability strongly dictates that when the dust finally settled and the track marshals reached the wreckage, Ken Wharton would have been pulled from the twisted metal, battered, broken, and in immense pain, but he would have been breathing. The ultimate tragedy of the Ardmore event is not simply that a great, multi-talented champion died in a high-speed crash. The profound, lingering sorrow lies in the sheer, mathematical preventability of his demise. The official investigation blamed the inherent risks of the sport and the presence of the straw bales, entirely ignoring the fatal systemic omission inside the cockpit. The governing bodies accepted the loss of life because they lacked the scientific understanding and the institutional courage to challenge the deadly, pervasive myth of being thrown clear. Ken Wharton was an absolute master of mechanical control. He understood the complex physics of tire adhesion, weight transfer, and engine torque better than almost any man of his generation. He survived the most dangerous, unforgiving mountain passes and racing circuits across Europe through sheer skill, immense bravery, and calculated precision. He commanded a machine with thousands of perfectly synchronized moving parts. Yet all of that immense knowledge, all of that hard-earned veteran experience, was rendered useless by the absence of one static strip of fabric. The outcome of the crash was no longer determined by his highly capable hands, but by the merciless, indifferent gravity of the New Zealand sky. Surviving the most brutal infernos, but perishing simply due to a forgotten lifeline. Ken Wharton's life closed with a puzzle that the sport would take decades to solve. When the telegrams finally reached the automotive garages of London and the newsrooms across the United Kingdom, the initial reaction was not merely sorrow. It was a deep, pervasive state of absolute bewilderment. The European racing establishment received the reports from the Ardmore circuit with a heavy, paralyzing disbelief. The narrative simply did not align with the established reality of the sport. Ken Wharton, the man who had routinely conquered the most lethal conditions the continent had to offer, had been killed on a flat, concrete runway at the very edge of the world. It read like a geographical and statistical anomaly. To the mechanics who turned the wrenches and the drivers who shared the starting grids, Wharton was an immovable fixture. He represented a specific rugged breed of competitor that defined the post-war era of motorsport. He was the undisputed master of all terrain. His legacy was built on a foundation of immense, unparalleled versatility that simply does not exist in modern, highly specialized racing. He did not confine himself to the smooth, swept asphalt of the Grand Prix circuits. He sought out the most grueling, punishing environments a machine could endure. Consider the environments he had mastered. He had wrestled heavy, underpowered saloon cars through the dead of night in the Monte Carlo Rally. He had navigated treacherous, ice-covered mountain passes, driving through blinding snowstorms and deep, frozen mud while fighting severe sleep deprivation. He possessed the rare mechanical empathy required to keep a fragile engine running across thousands of miles of hostile territory. Beyond the endurance rallies, he dominated the specialized, unforgiving discipline of the British Hill Climb Championship. He launched cold, high-horsepower machines up narrow, winding rural lanes flanked by solid stone walls and sheer drops. He memorized every single millimeter of camber, every hidden bump, and every shifting patch of grip on those hillsides. He secured 4 consecutive national titles in an arena where a fraction of a second of lost concentration resulted in an immediate, catastrophic impact with the landscape. He had gripped the heavy wooden steering wheels of Grand Prix machines at Monza, Spa, and Silverstone. He had looked the most terrifying corners in the world in the eye and calculated the exact mathematical limit of adhesion. He had even survived the ultimate nightmare of the era, pulling his own burning body from the flaming wreckage of a Van Wall chassis. He had endured the intense heat, the severe burns, and the long, painful recovery, only to return to the cockpit with his nerve intact. Because he had survived so much, a silent, unspoken consensus had formed around him within the European paddocks. He was viewed as a permanent survivor. He was the seasoned veteran who knew exactly where the edge of the abyss was and how to walk a tightrope right beside it without losing his balance. He was the benchmark of vehicle control. Therefore, the news of his demise on a repurposed airfield in New Zealand shattered a vital psychological shield for his peers. If a man possessing Wharton's magnitude of skill, experience, and deep mechanical wisdom could be erased by a simple slide on loose gravel and a missing piece of canvas, then no one wearing a racing helmet was truly safe. His death served as a cold, undeniable proof that the sport they dedicated their lives to was fundamentally indifferent to past achievements. The laws of physics do not respect a four-time national champion. Kinetic energy does not recognize a veteran. The concrete runway does not yield to a man simply because he has survived worse. His sudden absence left a massive, unfillable void in the British racing scene. The garages where he had spent countless hours discussing gear ratios and suspension setups grew quiet. The grids of the hill climb events lost their reigning king. The men who raced against him were forced to confront the stark, uncomfortable reality of their chosen profession. Wharton's fate proved that survival in the 1950s was often a matter of pure, blind circumstance rather than pure driving ability. A driver could execute 1,000 corners perfectly, but a single patch of loose stone and a flawed safety philosophy could override a lifetime of unparalleled mastery. The legacy of Ken Wharton remains firmly anchored in the historical ledgers of motorsport. He stands as a towering figure of a bygone era, a time when men drove across borders, changed vehicles from one day to the next, and raced purely for the raw mechanical challenge of the machine. He was a true ruler of all automotive domains. He proved that human skill could tame heavy iron and raw horsepower across any surface, from the snowbanks of the Alps to the high-speed straights of the Grand Prix circuits. Yet, his final moments under the bright southern hemisphere sun serve as a permanent, sobering warning. His passing is a brutal testament to the fragile nature of human life when placed inside a heavy machine traveling at extreme velocities. It highlights the fatal cost of institutional stubbornness and the slow, agonizing evolution of automotive safety. The sport eventually learned the lessons written in the dust of the Ardmore circuit, mandating the harnesses and protective structures that could have kept him securely in his seat. But those changes arrived far too late for the multi-talented giant of British motorsport. Ken Wharton left this world as a versatile talent falling at the edge of the earth. His death was more than a misjudgment on the tarmac. It was science demanding change inside the cockpit. What are your thoughts on this cruel paradox? Drop a comment below. If you like this video, please subscribe to Terminal Velocity for more files. Thanks for tuning in, and farewell.